Alright guys, chapter 5, Crime and Punishment. It's true, I did think of asking Razumikin to help me find some work recently. I was going to ask him if he couldn't get me some private teaching or something of that sort. The recollection suddenly dawned upon Raskolnikov. But how can he help me now, supposing he is able to get me some teaching, supposing he does have a kopeck to spare, so I can even buy a pair of boots and have my clothes mended to be able to go and give lessons? Well, and what then? What will I be able to do on a few pyataks, Pyataks? Is that what I require? It's really rather silly of me to have come to see Razumikin. Oh yeah, that was the friend they were talking about at the end of the chapter. I was thinking it was his sister's husband-to-be. The question of why he had now come to see Razumikin was troubling him even more than he himself was aware. He kept searching uneasily for some ill-omened significance in this apparently most ordinary of actions. Wait a moment. Did I really think I could put everything right just by going to see Razumikin, find a way out in the person of Razumikin? He wondered to himself in astonishment. Find a way out in the person of Razumikin. He thought and rubbed his forehead, and it was a strange thing that after a long spell of reflection, there suddenly occurred to him, almost without being prompted, a certain very peculiar idea. Razumikin, he suddenly said very calmly, as though he had reached some final decision. I'm going to see Razumikin, of course I am, only not right now. I'll go and see him the day after it, when it's all over and everything's begun anew. And suddenly he came to his senses. After that, he exclaimed, leaping up from the bench, is that going to happen? Is it really going to happen? He abandoned the bench and set off, almost at a run. His original intention had been to turn back and go home, but the thought of going home suddenly seemed a horribly repulsive one. There in his corner, in that horrible cupboard of his, all this had been fermenting within him for more than a month now, and he moved wherever his eyes led him. His nervous trembling had become slightly feverish. He thought he might possibly be catching a chill, for even in this heat, he felt cold. Almost unconsciously, prompted by a kind of inner necessity, he began with a kind of effort to scrutinize every object he encountered, as though in desperate quest of some diversion. But this failed to work, and he kept sinking back into a state of brooding. But when, with a sudden start, he raised his head again and looked around him, he immediately forgot what he had been thinking about a moment ago, and even what part of town he had been walking through. In this fashion, he traversed the whole of Vasily Island, came out onto the Little Neva, crossed the bridge, and turned into the direction of the islands. At first, his tired eyes found the leafy coolness agreeable, used as they were to the dust and slaked lime of the city, and to its enormous constricting and oppressive buildings. Here there was neither humidity nor stench nor drinking dens, but soon even these new agreeable sensations gave way to ones that were morbid and irritating. Sometimes he would stop in front of some dacha, lavishly adorned with verdure, look through the fence and see, far away on the balconies and terraces, finely dressed women, and in the garden, children running about. He was particularly caught by the flowers. He looked at them longer than at anything else. He also encountered sumptuous carriages, horsemen and horsewomen. He followed them with an inquisitive gaze and forgot about them before they had even disappeared from view. Once he stopped in order to count his money. He turned out to have 30 kopecks, 20 to the policeman, 3 to Nastasia for the letter. That means I must have given the Marmeladovs 47 or 50 kopecks yesterday, he thought, for some reason totaling it up, but he had soon even forgotten the reason he had pulled the money from his pocket in the first place. As he was passing some sort of eating establishment that looked like a cook shop, it came back to him, and he suddenly felt hungry. Entering the cook shop, he drank a glass of vodka and had a pie with some kind of filling. He finished it as he went on his way. It was a very long time since he had drunk vodka, and it had an instant effect on him, even though he had only had one glass. His legs suddenly grew heavy, and he began to feel a powerful inclination to sleep. He turned back in a homeward direction, but when he reached Petrovsky Island, he stopped in complete exhaustion, wandered off the road into the bushes, collapsed into the grass, and fell asleep that very same instant. When one is in a morbid state of health, one's dreams are often characterized by an unusual vividness and brilliance, and also by an extremely lifelike quality. Sometimes the scene that is conjured up is a monstrous one, yet the setting and the entire process of its representation are so lifelike and executed with details that are so subtle, astonishing, yet correspond in an artistic sense to the integral nature of the whole, that the dreamer himself could never invent them while awake, not even if he were an artist of the order of Pushkin or Turgenev. Dreams such as these, the morbid ones, invariably remain in the memory long afterwards and have a powerful effect on the individual's deranged and already overstimulated organism. Raskolnikov had a terrible dream. It was a dream about his childhood back in the little town where they had lived. He was about 7 years old, and he was taking a walk on a holiday towards evening somewhere beyond the outskirts with his father. It was a gray sort of day, overcast and humid, and the locality looked exactly the way it had survived in his memory. Even in his memory, it had become far more indistinct than it was now in his dream. The little town stood in an exposed position as on the palm of someone's hand, with not a willow in sight, somewhere very far away, right on the edge of the horizon. A patch of forest showed up black. At a few yards removed from the town's last kitchen garden stood a drinking house. A very large drinking house that had always produced in him the most unpleasant sensations, amounting almost to fear. Whenever he walked past it on those outings with his father, there was always such a crowd in there. There was so much yelling, laughter, and foul language, so much hoarse and ugly singing, and such frequent fighting. There were always so many drunken and frightening characters lounging about outside. When they encountered them, he would always press up close against his father, trembling all over. The road passed close to the drinking house. It was a country road, always dusty, and its dust was always so black. On it went, winding and twisting, and after some 300 yards or so, it veered off to the right, skirting the town cemetery. In the middle of the cemetery stood a stone church with a green onion dome. A couple of times a year, he would visit the church with his father and mother for Mass, when burial rites were performed in memory of his grandmother, who had died long ago and whom he had never seen. On these occasions, they always took with them some kutya, Kutya, on a white dish wrapped in a napkin. And the kutya was a sugary sort made of rice with raisins pressed into it in the form of a cross. He loved this church with its old icons, most of them without mountings, and the old priest with his trembling head. Beside his grandmother's tomb, on which there lay a funerary slab, was the little grave of his younger brother, who had died at the age of 6 months, whom he also had never known at all, and of whom he had no memory. He had, however, been told that he had had a younger brother, and every time he visited the cemetery, he would cross himself above the little grave in religious awe, bowing down to it and kissing it. And this was what he dreamt. He and his father were walking along the road to the cemetery, and passing the drinking house, he was holding his father's hand and looking over at the drinking house with fear. Something special was going on, and it drew his attention. On this occasion, too, there seemed to be the sound of festive merrymaking, a dressed-up crowd of artisans, wives, and peasant women, their husbands, and all kinds of riffraff. They were all drunk and singing songs, and by the entrance to the drinking house stood a cart, but it was a strange sort of cart. It was one of those big ones that are usually drawn by great cart horses and are used for transporting goods and wine barrels. He had always liked watching those enormous cart horses with their long manes and brawny legs, moving at a tranquil, measured pace as they hauled along an entire mountain of goods with not a shadow of strain, as though they actually found it easier to move when they had had such a load to haul than when they did not. It was a strange thing, however, that in the present instance of one of these massive carts had been harnessed up to a small, thin, grayish peasant jade, one of the kind which he had often seen sometimes overstrain themselves when hauling a tall load of hay or firewood, particularly if the cart gets bogged down in the mire or in a rut, in which the muskies always beat so viciously with their knouts, sometimes even about the muzzle and the eyes, and the sight of this would always make him feel so sorry that he would almost burst into tears, and his mother would take him away from the window. But all of a sudden it had started to get very noisy out from the drinking house. Drunk as lords, shouting, singing, brandishing balalaikas, came some big muskies in red and blue shirts, their armyaks thrown over their shoulders. "Come on, get in, the lot of you," one of them shouted, a man still young with a fat neck and a meaty face that was as red as a carrot. "I'll take you all, get in." Instantly, however, there was a burst of laughter and exclamations. "That old jade'll never make it. Come off it." Mikolka Have you lost your brains or what, harnessing that little filly to that great cart? That little gray mare must be all of 20 by now, lads. Get in, I'm going to take you all, Makolka said, leaping into the cart first, taking the reins and standing up at full length on the front board. At full height on the front board. Matt Vey went off with the bay this morning, he shouted from the cart. And this little filly's fair breaking my heart. I feel like doing her in. She eats her oats and gives nothing back. Get in, I say. I'll fly there at the gallop. I'll make her gallop. And he picked up his knout, preparing with satisfaction to flog the little gray mare. Go on, get in, why don't you? People laugh in the crowd. You heard him. He's going to fly there at the gallop. I'll bet that mare hasn't galloped in 10 years, while she's going to now. Don't spare her, lads. Take nouts, all of you. Have them ready. That's right, flog her. Roaring with laughter and cracking jokes, they all piled into the Makolka's cart. Six of them got in, and there was room for even more. They took a fat, red-cheeked peasant woman with them. She was dressed in bright red calico with a kichka and beads and kadi on her feet. She was cracking nuts and laughing softly to herself. The people in the crowd that surrounded them were also laughing, and indeed, how could they fail to laugh? A wretched little mare like that going to pull such a load at a gallop? Two of the lads in the cart at once picked up nouts in order to lend Makolka a hand. At the cry of "Gee up!" the little jade began to tug with all their might, but not only was she unable to set off at a gallop, she could barely manage to move forward at all. Her legs skittered about underneath her as she whinnied. How sad. As she whinnied and cowered under the blows from the three nouts that rained down on her to no effect whatsoever. The laughter in the cart and among the crowd doubled in intensity, but Makolka lost his temper and began to flog the little mare even harder, as though he really believed he could make her gallop. Let me have a go, lads, a young fellow who had now got a taste for the thing shouted from the crowd. Get in, all of you, get in, Makolka shouted. She'll take us all, I'll flog her. And he lashed her until he hardly knew what he was doing in his frenzy. Papa, Papa, he cried to his father. Papa, what are they doing, Papa? They're beating the poor little horse. Come along, said his father. They're drunk, playing mischief, the fools. Come along, don't look. And he tried to draw him away, but he broke loose from his father's arms, and broke loose from his father's arms, and beside himself ran over to the little horse. But by this time, the little horse was in a bad way. It would gasp, stop moving, start tugging again, and then nearly fall down. Flog her to death, cried Makolka. It's come to that. I'll do it myself. What's the matter, wood devil? Not got a Christian heart in you? An old man called from the crowd. Have you ever seen a little jade like that pull such a load? Another man added. You'll do her in, shouted a third. Leave me alone. She belongs to me. I'll do as I like with her. More of you get in, all of you. I'll damn well make her gallop. Suddenly a loud volley of laughter rang out, drowning everything. The little mare, unable to endure the intensified rain of blows, had begun an ineffectual kicking of her hind legs. The old man could not repress a bitter smile. It was true enough, a wretched little mare like that, yet she could still kick. Two more lads in the crowd each took another knout and ran over to the little horse in order to whip its flanks. One lad ran to either side. Whip her on the muzzle, on the eyes, Makolka shouted. Fuck Makolka. A song, lads, someone shouted from the cart, and everybody in the cart joined in. A song with dubious words rang out. A tambourine rattled, and there was whistling during the refrains. The woman went on cracking nuts and laughing softly to herself. And fuck that peasant woman, too. He was running alongside the little horse. Now he was a few steps ahead of it. He could see it being whipped across the eyes, right across the eyes. He was crying. His heart rose up within him. His tears flowed. One of the lads who were doing the whipping caught him on the face with his knout. He felt nothing, screaming, his hands working convulsively. He rushed towards the gray-haired old man with the gray beard who was shaking his head and condemning the whole scene. One of the peasant women took him by the arm and tried to lead him away, but he tore himself free and ran back to the little horse once more, even though by this time it was at its last gasp. It was beginning to kick again. What the hell's the matter with you? Makolka shrieked in a fury. He threw down the knout, leaned over, and hauled from the bottom of the cart a long, thick cart shaft, took hold of one end of it in both hands, and with an effort proceeded to brandish it over the little gray mare. He's going to kill her, the shout went round. He's going to do her in. She belongs to me, Makolka shouted and swung the shaft down at full force. There was the sound of a heavy blow. Take the whip to her. Why have you stopped? Voices shouted from the crowd. But Makolka was brandishing the cart shaft for a second time, and another blow landed with full force on the back of the unfortunate jade. She sank right back on her hindquarters, but then leaped up again and started tugging with all the strength she had left in various directions in order to get going with her load. But whichever way she moved, she was greeted by 6 nouts, and the cart shaft rose and fell a third time, and then a fourth. In measured rhythm, with all its wielder's might, Makoko was in a frenzy of rage because he was unable to kill her with one blow. She certainly got some life in her, the shout went round. That's fucked up. She'll fall down in a minute, lads. It's all over with her now. One versed in such matters called from the crowd. Take an axe to her, for God's sakes. Get it over with quickly, cried a third. Ach, I'll make you eat those flies. Let me through, Makoko shrieked violently, throwing down the shaft. He leaned inside the cart once more and hauled out an iron crowbar. Watch out, he cried, and with all his might he swung it down on his poor little beast. The blow thudded down. The little mare began to totter, sank down, tried to give another tug, but the crowbar again came down on her back, and she fell to the ground as if all her four legs had been cut away from under her at once. Finish her off, Makoko shouted, leaping out of the cart as though he no longer knew what he was doing. A few of the lads who were also red-faced and drunken seized hold of whatever they could lay their hands on, knouts, sticks, the cart shaft, and ran over to the dying mare. Makoko stood to one side and began to beat her on the spine with the crowbar at random. The jade stretched her muzzle forwards, uttered a heavy sigh, and died. That's the end of her, people shouted in the crowd. She ought to have galloped. Or he didn't even scream it. She ought to have galloped. She belongs to me, Makoko shouted, holding the crowbar, his eyes bloodshot. He stood there looking at it as though he were sorry there was no creature left to beat. It's right enough. Anyone can see you haven't got a Christian heart in you, many voices were now shouting from the crowd. But the poor boy was now beside himself. With a howl, he forced his way through the crowds towards the little gray mare, flung his arms around her head, bloodied muzzle, and kissed her on the eyes, on the lips. Then he suddenly leaped up and rushed at Makoko, hammering at him with his little fist. At that point, his father, who had been chasing after him for a long time, finally seized hold of him and carried him away from the crowd. Come along, his father said to him. We're going home. Papa, the poor little horse, why did they kill it? He sobbed, but his breathing was choked, and again those howls escaped from his constricted breast, or his constricted chest. And this is supposed to be a dream, but I wonder if it's a nightmare. They're drunk. They're up to They're drunk. They're up to mischief. It's none of our business. Come on, his father said. He flung his arms around his father, but his chest felt so tight, he felt he wanted to draw breath, to scream, and woke up. He awoke panting, drenched in sweat, even his hair sweat soaked, and sat up in horror. Thank God it was only a dream, he said, settling down under a tree, taking a deep breath. But what is this? I must be catching a fever. What an ugly dream. His entire body felt paralyzed. His soul was dark and troubled. He put his elbows on his knees and supported his head in both hands. Oh God, he exclaimed, will I really do it? Will I really take an axe and hit her on the head with it, smash her skull in? Will I slip on her warm, sticky blood, break open the lock, steal the money, and tremble, then hide myself covered in blood with the axe? Oh Lord, will I really? As he said this, he was trembling like a leaf. But what's got into me, he went on, hunching up again, and if indeed, somebody's calling me, but let me drink some water. So I think he was thinking about robbing somebody. Okay, so as he said this, he was trembling like a leaf. But what's gotten into me, he went on, hunching up again as if in deep amazement. I mean, I didn't know that I'd never have the endurance for this, so why have I been torturing myself all this time? I mean, even yesterday when I went to do that rehearsal, I knew yesterday for certain that I'd never be able to go through with it. So what am I doing now? Why can I still not make up my mind about it? I mean, yesterday when I was coming down the staircase, I told myself it was vile, loathsome, base. I mean, the very thought of it made me feel sick and gave me the horrors in real life. No, I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't. Not even if there were no uncertainties in all those calculations. Not if everything I've determined to do this past month was as clear as daylight, as plain as arithmetic. Lord, why? Not even then could I do it. I mean, I simply couldn't go through with it. I couldn't, and that's it. So why, even now? He rose to his feet, looked around him in astonishment, as though he were wondering how he had got there, and set off towards T.V. Bridge. He was pale, his eyes were burning, he was suffering from exhaustion in every limb, but suddenly his breathing seemed to grow easier. He felt now that he had thrown off that terrible burden which had been weighing him down for so long, and his soul began suddenly to experience a sense of lightness and peace. Oh Lord, he prayed, show me my path, and I will renounce this accursed dream of mine. As he crossed the bridge, he looked quietly and calmly at the Neville, at the brilliant going down of the brilliant red sun. In spite of his In spite of his debilitated condition, he did not even feel tired. It was as though the abscess on his heart, which had been gathering to a head all month, had suddenly burst. Freedom, freedom. Now he was free from that sorcery, that witchcraft, that fascination, that infatuation. Later on, when he remembered that time and all that had happened to him during those days, minute by minute, point by point, detail by detail, there was always one thing that struck him with an almost superstitious wonder, even though it was something that was, in essence, not really all that unusual. To him, however, it always seemed like some preordained announcement of his fate. Namely, he could not for the life of him understand or explain to himself why, in his tired, exhausted state, when the best thing he could have done was to take the very shortest and most direct route home, he should have gone home by way of the Haymarket, which did not lie on his route at all. Even though it was a small detour, it was nevertheless an obvious and quite unnecessary one. Of course, it was true that he had gone home dozens of times without taking note of the streets he was walking along. But then why, he always wondered afterwards, why should he have had an encounter? Why should he have had an encounter which was at one and the same time of such important, decisive consequence for him, and of such an extremely fortuitous nature in the Haymarket of all places where he had not even any reason to be? And why should it have occurred at precisely that hour, that minute of his life, coinciding with precisely that coloring of his mood and with precisely those circumstances which made it quite inevitable that encounter should produce the most devastating and lasting influence on his entire personal fate, as though it had been waiting for him there on purpose? So I feel like he's gonna go into a situation that kind of seemed that he had no control over. By the time he crossed the Haymarket, it was about 9 o'clock. All the tradesmen with tables, trays, stalls, benches were closing up their establishments, or taking down and clearing away their wares and dispersing to their homes in the same way as their customers were doing. Next to the cook shops that occupy the lower floors of the Haymarket buildings in the dirty and stinking courtyards, and most of all outside the drinking dens, there were jostling crowds of small manufacturers and rag pickers of every sort. Raskolnikov preferred these haunts, along with all the neighboring lanes and alleyways, to any other part of town whenever he went out walking with no purpose. Here his rags drew no snooty attention, and it was possible for him to go about looking any way he chose without scandalizing anyone. Right at the corner of K Lane, an artisan and a peasant woman, his wife, were selling goods at two tables: thread, braid, cotton headscarves, and the like. They were also clearing up and making ready to go home, but were being rather slow about it, talking with an acquaintance of theirs who had approached them. This acquaintance was Lizaveta Ivanovna, or simply, as everyone called her, Lizaveta, the younger sister of that very same old woman, Alyona Ivanovna, the collegiate registrar's widow and pawnbroker, in whose home Raskolnikov had been the day before he had gone there in order to pawn his watch and perform his rehearsal. He already knew all about Lizaveta, and she even knew him a little. She was a tall, ungainly, timid, and submissive female of about 35, practically an idiot, who lived in complete slavery to her sister and drudged for her day and night, going in fear of her and even enduring beatings from her. She was standing reflectively face to face with the artisan and the peasant woman, holding a bundle and listening to them attentively. They were explaining something to her with peculiar animation. When Raskolnikov suddenly caught sight of her, a strange sensation resembling the most profound amazement took hold of him, even though there was nothing extraordinary about this encounter. "You do best to settle the matter yourself, Lizaveta." Lizaveta Ivan. Okay, let's see. So this is the bottom of page 75. "You do best to settle the matter yourself, Lizaveta Ivanovna," the artisan said loudly. "Come and see us tomorrow at about 7. Those folk will be coming here then, too." "Tomorrow?" Lizaveta said in a slow, reflective voice, as though unable to make her mind up about something. "My, that Alyona Ivanovna's fairly got the wind up you," the tradesman's wife, a no-nonsense sort of woman, began to prattle. "Look at you, you're just like a little infant. She's not even your own kith and kin, just a half-sister, and look at the power she has over you." "Oh, don't you say anything to Alyona Ivanovna about it this time, miss," said her husband, interrupting. "That's my advice. Just come by and see us without asking. It's a good bargain you'll be getting. Your sister will be able to work it out for herself later on." "You want me to come by?" tomorrow at 7, and there'll be some of those folk here too, miss. You'll be able to settle the matter for yourself. And we'll have the samovar ready, his wife. And we'll have the samovar ready, his wife added. Samovar, S-A-M-O-V-A-R. Ready, his wife added. Very well, I'll come, Lizaveta said, still reflecting, and slowly she began to move off down the street. By this time, Raskolnikov had passed where they were standing and heard no more. He had made his passage quietly, unobtrusively, trying not to miss a single word. His initial amazement had little by little given way to horror as a cold chill ran down his spine. He had suddenly had a stroke and quite unexpectedly learned that at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening, Lizaveta, the old woman's sister and her sole living companion, would not be at home, and that consequently at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening, the old woman would be at home, completely alone. He only had a few paces left to go to the entrance to his lodgings. He went up to his room like a man who has been condemned to death. His mind was completely empty, and he was quite incapable of filling it with anything, but with his whole being he suddenly felt that he no longer possessed any freedom of thought or of will, that everything had suddenly been decided once and for all. It went without saying that even had he spent years on end waiting for a suitable occasion, not even then, assuming that he had still had the same plan, could he have counted on a more obvious step towards the successful realization of that plan than the one that had suddenly presented itself just then. At any rate, it would have been difficult to ascertain yesterday, with the greatest degree of exactitude and the smallest amount of risk, circumventing the need for all dangerous questions and inquiries, that tomorrow, at that particular time, that particular old woman, the one on whose life he was preparing to make an attempt, would be at home all on her very own. You could rob her, bro. You don't gotta kill her. Anyway, let me drink some water.